Jeff mentioned the Independent Women's Forum where I work. It's a 26-year-old organization. We did start as an ad hoc group called Women for Clarence Thomas. So we were pretty busy this year when the Kavanaugh hearings were, were going on. I do think the Kavanaugh effect was real with the Senate elections. How about that? So my work is primarily based in Washington, although I do live here in Colorado. I live in Denver County. Boy, that's a lonely place. But let me tell you, I've lived in Colorado almost 5 years now, and it is such a special place, and I'm just so glad to live here. I'm like a lot of people, though. I haven't lived here that long. There's a lot of people in Colorado like me who are transplants. And I will say not only is Colorado unique politically because of the moving of people across state lines, but there's been a lot of movement in Colorado, like the rest of the country, when it comes to people's political perspectives. And I'd say my first main point is we have a lot of division in our country. We have a rural-urban divide. If you look at the county maps, not just of Colorado, but every state, you can see where the city centers are, and they're dark blue, and the rest of the country is red. You can see a big divide and a growing divide between especially white, college-educated women and white men without college degrees. I mean, these are two groups that used to be politically pretty similar. Now they're very different, with women moving to the left and men moving to the right. So these are issues that are impacting the country politically, but they're issues here in Colorado too. And for this reason, because there's so much division based on these demographic characteristics and our life experiences, and people are so much more than the boxes we check on a census form, but it tells us a lot about people's politics today, and I think that's sad. I think we ought to, I think especially as conservatives, we consider people first as individuals, people capable of independent thinking, but that's not the way the ground game has gone in this midterm election, because like a lot of midterm elections, it was kind of a turnout game. There wasn't a lot, and this is my second main point, there wasn't a lot of persuasion going on. It was really about people who see the world very differently trying to get their own teams to come out to the ballot box. I want to do a little experiment, if you'll indulge me, and ask the people in this room to raise their hand when I say an issue, if it was your number one issue motivating you to vote in the state elections in Colorado. So I'll start with the economy. How many people thought the economy was the number one issue? Okay. What about immigration? Immigration. Okay. What about education? Okay. What about health care? All right. Okay, so this is it's very interesting for me to see this. Kaiser did a poll of Coloradans ahead of this year's election, so it's not an exit poll, but it's the closest thing that we have, asking people what their number one issues were, and tied for first place at 21% each were education and health care. But there's so much more underneath those top lines. For example, on the healthcare issue, 33% of Democrats said that was their top issue, and only about 12% of Republicans in Colorado said. And that matches with the national trend that although healthcare was the number one issue, nationwide, a plurality of voters, about 41%, said healthcare was their top issue. It was much more motivating on the Democratic side, and healthcare voters broke for Democrats at a rate of 3-1. And I think that's primarily because, not only are we disagreeing on the issues, but we're disagreeing about what issues we think ought to take priority. So we're really genuinely, as Americans, living in two different worlds, two different Americas, which I think makes it very hard to communicate and very hard to persuade our fellow Coloradans and our fellow Americans. But I will point out a couple places, points of hope, and that is that in places where Republicans were able to defend themselves, and we don't have to win every issue, but we at least have to come to the table. In states like Indiana and Missouri, where Republicans picked up Senate seats, these were places where nationwide, about 58% of people say they trust Democrats more on the issue of health care, specifically with pre-existing conditions. In those two states, that was fought to a draw. About 50-50 people said, I trust Republicans and Democrats the same on that issue. I think a lot of these issues aren't even really about the policy ideas, but they are signals to voters. Health care is one of those where I think especially suburban women, college-educated women are looking at this issue asking, do you care about people? That's really what's behind this. And I spent some time today actually on a website I recommend all of you go visit, called coloradoresistance.org. Because it was enlightening to me. There's a manual, they have a playbook, they have a plan. And specifically when it comes to some of these issues, you can just see in the language they're using, and this is true in some of the things that Jared Polis wrote about healthcare. He says, let's get straight to it. Healthcare is a human right, and that's not a policy position really, but it's a principle statement, and it's something that serves as a proxy about where do you stand on caring for others. And so if we're going to, I hope, bring Colorado back from the light blue shade into purple territory and eventually turn the state red again, then I think we have to think about this battle of ideas differently. We have to be persuaders, and we have to be persuasive, and we have to meet people where they are. So for example, if there's a number of unaffiliated voters or independent voters saying, this issue is most important to me, we can't come back and say, but look at the economy, man, because the economy is great. Don't get me wrong. But we have to meet people where they are, and we have to at least defend our position on some of these issues that we may not think, as conservatives, are the top issues of the day. So seeing the world through the eyes of some of these unaffiliated voters who, many of them, like me, have transplanted to Colorado, because we do have inroads and we do have reasons to be encouraged. Jeff mentioned the ballot initiatives on the ideas. There's room for agreement. I think we ought to work on our branding as conservatives, because I think that's ultimately what turned a lot of voters off to Republican candidates. But if we can do the education, for example, explaining things like, what does it really mean for something to be a fee? That's something we're going to have to talk about over the course of the next couple of years, because Tabor may protect us in some way from tax increases, but if the legislature tries to call something a fee, or when it's really a tax, then our fellow Coloradans should know that, because they've demonstrated on this ballot this year that they don't want their taxes to be increased. And so I think if we can shoot straight with people and explain the issues, come to the table, talk about all of the policy ideas, represent our principles in a way that shows not just what we're against, but what we're for, show that we're willing to fight for people, then I think that we have a lot to be hopeful about. And if you're really down in the dumps, I go back and read The Crisis by Thomas Paine every once in a while. That always cheers me up.
Amen.